Hi, I'm Ross Brownson. I work at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm a faculty member there, and I'm glad to be with you today to talk about writing specific aims. Writing your aims page is really a key part on your journey to success and impact of your project in implementation science. You recall from last week, we talked about your logic model for success, and your grant, and especially your specific aims within that grant, is a key part of that success. Today we're going to discuss these topics with you. This relates to the articles you'll be reading, your ebook assignment, and the checklist that you'll be working on. We're going to spend a little bit of time on each of the 4 aims, and then we're also going to spend some time with a question and answer when we meet together next week. Many of the parts of writing a grant in implementation science or the longer term dissemination implementation science is similar to that for any grant. But there are some important differences. You want to ask yourselves about which D&I questions you're asking. How do those aims differ from other kinds of grants? Some of the ways they might differ could be whether your evidence-based practice or policy has been defined sufficiently. You mentioned you identify an implementation science framework or model on the aims page. Do you document your team's success? And then it's really important that you're measuring not only effectiveness. If you're measuring only effectiveness, it's probably not an implementation science study. Of course, we all like to know what gets us funded in the first place. This is a regression analysis showing which of the 5 subcomponents in grant scoring predict your overall impact score on the right. As many of you know, that impact score on the right is what gets you funded or not. The perfect score is a 10 and the worst score is a 90. What this shows is that, as you would expect, the approach or the methods is the strongest predictor. Significance and innovation are next, and following on that are investigators and environment. The relevance of this for the aims page is that you want to really touch on all 5 of these subcomponents, highlighting why they contribute to your impact. And we'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. There's a saying you may have heard that you get one chance to make a first impression. And that's definitely true for the aims page. It's an extremely important part of your grant. Many people who have been both grant writers and reviewers say that it's the most important part. And really there's what I would call a binary impression that's created here. That is, a reviewer typically reads your aims page and you get a halo, a positive first impression, or a horns, a not such a great first impression. And what typically happens is after people make that binary decision, they read the rest of your application with what I call confirmation bias. They're reading the rest to reinforce an impression they've already established. So essentially what you're doing on the aims page is you're encapsulating significance, innovation, approach, probably a little bit about experience and environment, all on one page. So it's sort of a daunting task, but it's really important. And more than any other part of your grant application, every single word is very important. So if we were together in person, this would be the class participation part. But I want you to pause the video for just a minute and hold up a question. What's the key piece of information on the aims page that will get a reviewer excited about your project and make them want to read more? So pause for a minute, write that down, think about it. We're going to have you enter that in a discussion block, or we're going to talk about it next week when we meet real time in person. So keep that question in mind as we go forward. As a backdrop to writing your application, I want you to keep 4 sort of macro issues in mind. The first is the audience to whom you're writing your application. Depending on where you submit, the people reviewing your grant might know a lot or a little. That'll depend in part on whether you're writing to a targeted request for applications or a more broad call that goes to what we call a standing study section at NIH or another funding agency. A standing study section has diverse expertise. So assume you're writing to an audience with a wide range of disciplines, the people who are familiar, you don't want to belabor common things, common ideas. But for reviewers that come from other disciplines, you want to make sure you explain your ideas well. You talk in plain language. You avoid a lot of jargon as you introduce your aims. So that's part one. Part two is the context. Within context, I often think about put yourself in the position of a reviewer who's maybe doing this at night on the weekends. They put their kids to bed. They're a little tired. They might be a little grumpy. And you want to write to that. So you want to make sure your aims page is interesting. It grabs them. They read the aims and they think, oh, this is something that's interesting. They're introducing me to an interesting story. And now I think I want to read more. That's really what you're trying to open the door. When I ask colleagues to review my grants, I ask them to put themselves in this position and ask them to be a brutal reviewer. I ask them to review it as if they could only find the weaknesses in the grant. Don't tell me about any of the good things, but tell me about the weaknesses and help me improve the grant. That's where you really want that early input. The third and fourth issues relate to aesthetics and organization. And I'll give you an example in a minute of aesthetics. Try to stay away from dense text. Try to put things in little blocks of text. You might use underlining. You might think like a journalist where you have a small amount of text separated by space. And consider highlighting some text. I use underlining where you're highlighting important phrases on the aims page. And then the organization is just like you would think. You want to have a logical flow. You want to make sure your aims follow a standard set of thinking, the way of introducing your ideas and taking it through. And we're going to give you a formula for that in just a minute. Here's an aims page. I don't want you to worry on this one about the actual details on the aims page. I just want you to sort of take a look at the overall aims page and just see how it's pleasing to the eye. This is a grant by my colleague, Matt Kruder. He's a health communication expert, and he always writes grants that have a very good content as well as a really nice visual appeal. You can see how there's white space between the paragraphs. He's highlighted that top section with the box, and then the aims themselves are bolded. Certain phrases are underlined, and the text is offset so it's easy to see. So aside from the content, that aesthetic look is really important. So here's a little bit more of a backdrop. Here's something about the essence of an aims page. Remember, as I said before, this is where they're going to make that initial decision. We talk about the sizzle and the steak. We're trying to size up the general problem. We're trying to identify the idea, the gap in the literature that you're trying to fill. You're gonna answer that by setting up a set of activities around 2 to 3 realistic aims. We like to say things your mother or grandmother would understand. That is non-experts. So that's maybe a little too simple, but you get the idea. It's going to lay a little about the project. It's going to have a logical flow. That's the organizational part. And then the stake is how you'll accomplish these. These are really the activities with broad brush strokes. And then you'll bring it home. You talk about the implications. You talk about how the world will be a better place when your project is finished. That circles back to that idea of impact on the graph I showed, which is the defining characteristic about whether you get funded or not. If you think about your favorite novel, an aims page is sort of the same thing. What you're really trying to do is give a summary of your story on only one page. A novel has a plot. That's the problem you're trying to solve. It has a cast. That's you and your team, including the experience you have. It has tension or conflict. What's going to happen if we don't solve this problem? What's the public health or political burden of not solving the problem? And then, of course, the innovation, what is new? The action is your aims and what you're going to do to accomplish those aims. And the resolution is what you'll learn. That's the impact of your grant. So if you think about the formula for doing this, we like to have people use 2 to 4 aims. It's usually less is more. So if you're thinking about, oh, should I have 3 aims or 4 aims? I always lean toward fewer aims and try to address those really well, the aims that you do have. You start off with significance. We'll give you an example in just a minute. Within that significance part, you talk from the broad to the more specific. Then you move to an optional paragraph on some of the preliminary or pilot studies. This is really important, especially for a larger sort of R01 scale grant. In a small grant, you know, sort of in the NIH jargon, an R03 grant, you're probably not going to have pilot studies because that grant itself is probably your pilot work. But this is a really important opportunity to showcase all the work you've done to set up your project. And then in the grants I work on, I like to set up a paragraph at the end that gives your conceptual framework, your study design, and then the piece that introduces the aims themselves. So here's a few examples. Here's a piece from a grant from Russ Glasgow, and you can see where they talk about the significance of the problem. They talk about the priorities of their funder, which is in this case the NIDDK of the NIH. A report, you'll see that report is specifically referenced. They get a little bit about their own work and why their work's important and the key question they're trying to answer. So that's sort of setting up the first part. And then here's an example of the pilot or preliminary work. Our 14-year line of investigation has illuminated the black box of primary care practice. I would also often include citations because, and this is work from Kurt Stange, they have many publications on this work, but you can see how they've woven a paragraph here to talk about their work and their experience working in primary care practices. That only set up the feasibility of doing the study, but it also sets up a bit more about the gap and the gap they filled so far and what's left. So that's important to keep in mind as well. If we think about the aims themselves, we like to have 2 or 3 aims. You might have up to 4 aims in a larger project. I like to have no more than 2 lines of text per aim. You want to use active verbs. I've given you some examples of those. Things like adapt, apply, assess, describe, estimate, or test, something that's got an active feel to it. You might include a statement of rationale. I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. You might include something about costs. And I like to sort of separate the aims from the activities. So I'll list the aim and then say, to accomplish this aim, we will do the following. And then I'll have to close at the very bottom of the aims page a summary paragraph on so what or who cares. I will often use the funder's own language and the review criteria, and I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. And then for smaller pilot studies, you also might talk about what's next. So I'm writing a K award, and this is going to lead toward the next body of work in an R01 grant or some other grant like that. The mechanism is probably less important than where it's going to take you, okay? So here's one example of an aim. You see the aim, you see the rationale, you see hypothesis, and then you see the activities to accomplish the aim. And this is from one of our grants. I think this is a 2-year grant that we did. You can see on this aims page, there are 2 specific aims. And then this is, I only put this one up because aim 2 specifically looks at cost. So this is a study related to colorectal cancer screening, and the cost element of this was very important. So they decided they wanted to have a standalone aim on cost. And so that's something to consider as well. This is a study from Brian Weiner at University of Washington. And then here's the take it home paragraph. Here's the paragraph at the end. You can see a lot of the review criteria are molded into this. Significant, our team's expertise, why it's innovative, and then you see the very last line, here's how our grant will have impact. This is a physical activity intervention. It's mildly an implementation science study, but I put it in here so you can see the way you frame that final paragraph, which is really important. What this is doing now, if you can imagine, in this grant, the rest of the grant is 12 pages, so it's getting people interested at the bottom of the same page. Now, I want to read the rest of the next 12 pages and reinforce how every one of those underlined phrases is carried forward in the rest of the grant. question that comes up a lot, and probably one of the most important questions we get, is about hypotheses. Do I include a hypothesis in my grant, especially on my aims page? And like so many things in life, the answer is it depends. I would say on larger grants, an R01 scale project, you almost always want to include a hypothesis. In a pilot grant that's developmental, I would also include research questions, but not testable empirical hypotheses. Often the funders will give you clues about this. They might want the grant to include hypotheses. You want to make sure if you do include a hypothesis or hypotheses that they are answerable and they're important. If they're just obvious or trite, you know, things are going to improve, something very vague, then it's probably not worth including. And I'll give you an example. You might include a mixture of hypotheses and research questions. That's what we did in this grant. So this was a grant, this is one of our grants. This is an R01 scale grant, so it's a larger 5-year grant. And you can see that for AIM 1, we did some developmental work. This was taking a questionnaire we had and trying to improve it. And you can see there we just included a few research questions about reliability and whether we could develop an objective measure of public health practice. The second aim, though, is really the largest part of the study that was quantitative and was looking at the effects of active dissemination methods in 6 intervention health departments and 6 control health departments. And you see there we included 3 hypotheses that relate more or less to pieces of the re-aim framework. And then we included a third aim that was more of a qualitative aim that relates to case studies. And so this is, for me at least, this is about the right balance of the way aims would be set up for a larger R01 scale project. And there are many, many different ways to think about aims. And here, I'm giving you 2 great resources for those with the syllabus. These are also, the links are also included in your syllabus. What we have here is a set of full grant applications from the National Cancer Institute and their Implementation Science Program, and also from the group, the Implementation Science Group at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who have a really nice web page they call TRACS, T-R-A-C-S. And so what you can get here, so you can go on NIH Reporter at any time and search for a grant name and the abstract, but you cannot get the full grant. And so that reporter from NIH will not include the aims page, whereas these are really valuable because you're able to go not only see the abstract, but the aims page, and then the whole grant of how people are addressing the scientific aims they've established. So I'd encourage you to not only use the examples that I provided, but go on here and look at other examples. That all of these are funded grants. Most of them have gone through what's called DIRH, the Dissemination and Implementation Science Research and Health Study section at NIH. I think they have a mixture of large grants, small grants, K awards. There's a nice mixture of different kinds of grants. So take a look at that and browse those. There's nothing like looking at other products that have been successful to learn how to frame and how to make your project also successful. And then finally, just some thank yous to colleagues. I've often said I've had sort of 1 or 2 original ideas in my life and stolen everything else from all of my colleagues who are smarter than me. And so Jeff Curran, Russ Glasgow, Matt Cruder, and Kurt Stange, who helped me with ideas and pieces of this presentation. And then I've always loved to hear from Snoopy. And so what we're looking forward to is writing down that question that I framed you earlier, the answer to that, as well as other questions when we meet to talk about aims page real time. So thanks for listening, and I'll look forward to talking to many of you soon.